When I first laid eyes on the house, I thought I was finally home. After 26 years in the military, I wanted peace, stillness, and something that reminded me of everything I used to fight for: freedom, dignity, and the right to live a quiet life on my own terms. The property backed up to Stillwater Lake, a stretch of glimmering blue, surrounded by pine trees and birdsong, the kind of scene you'd expect to find on a postcard or a motivational calendar. I bought the place 6 months after my wife passed away. She had always wanted a house by a lake. We'd talked about it for years, usually over dinner or on long drives when we dreamed of retiring together. I was too late to share it with her. But when I stepped onto that back porch and saw the gentle slope of the land leading down to the water, I whispered her name and promised her I'd make it ours. In some way, I thought I'd be able to feel her there. The house was older, modest, but well-built, with cedar siding and a wraparound porch that creaked underfoot like a cabin in the woods. The lake access, though, that was the crown jewel. A narrow path led from my back gate to a small wooden dock, aged but solid, where I could sit in the evenings with a glass of bourbon and watch the sun die a slow, golden death over the water. It was a kind of medicine. For months, I healed there in silence, speaking only to the ducks, the wind, and the fading echoes of my own thoughts. But peace, I would soon learn, is a fragile thing when someone else believes they have the right to control it. It started small, like it always does. A form letter in the mailbox, signed by the Stillwater Preserve Homeowners Association, reminded me of lawn maintenance guidelines. The HOA president, a woman named Charlene Dunn, had inserted a handwritten note in blue ink at the bottom. "We've noticed your backyard fence is not compliant with community uniformity standards. Please repaint to approved color, driftwood, gray number 43. It was polite, if a bit presumptuous. I ignored it. 2 weeks later, another letter came. This one was more formal. It referenced a clause buried in the community bylaws about visual conformity and threatened a fine if I didn't repaint the fence within 10 days. I had a gut feeling it was less about the color and more about who I was, or rather who I wasn't. I wasn't one of them. I didn't attend the monthly wine and cheese HOA mixers. I didn't play golf with the board. I kept to myself, which seemed to offend them. Still, I didn't want trouble. I painted the fence driftwood gray number 43 just as they asked. But the more I complied, the more they demanded. I trimmed the shrubs to regulation height. I re-angled my porch light. I moved the wind chimes from the front to the back of the house after a neighbor complained that they were too loud on breezy nights. The day things changed for good was the day I saw men in fluorescent vests digging posts at the edge of my property. It was early morning and I had just poured a cup of coffee. Through the kitchen window, I noticed a crew measuring and hammering near the slope that led down to the dock. I stepped outside, cup in hand, and walked toward them. "Morning," I said. A younger man with a clipboard looked up. "We're with the HOA," he said, jerking a thumb behind him where a white pickup with the HOA logo sat idling, "just putting up the new safety barrier." Safety barrier. A fence, he clarified, to prevent unauthorized lake access. Too many people cutting through. I frowned. "That's my access, my dock, my property." He didn't even blink. "It's community-managed shoreline, that's what I'm told." By the time Charlene Dunn arrived, 20 minutes later, the first section of the fence was already in place. Metal posts, wire mesh, and a chain-link gate with a padlock. "This is a misunderstanding," I said calmly, holding out my surveyor's map, the one I'd pulled from the county records office when I bought the place. It showed my land extending 15 feet past the tree line, all the way to the water's edge. The dock, the slope, the narrow path, all of it legally mine. She didn't even look at the map. "We've updated the HOA boundary maps," she said curtly, "and the board has voted to secure the shoreline for the safety of our residents." "I'm a resident. I mean the residents who follow the rules," she replied. I remember the feeling then, not anger, not yet. It was disbelief. I had fought in 2 wars, defended people's homes from actual enemies, and now I was being locked out of my own backyard by a woman who made PowerPoints about neighborhood flower beds. "I'm sorry, but this isn't over," I said. She gave me a tight smile. "You're welcome to take it up at the next board meeting." I did go to the meeting, sitting in the back, in a room that smelled of air freshener and entitlement. The board dismissed my concerns in under 5 minutes. The HOA lawyer, a smirking man with slicked hair, quoted an ambiguous clause about common waterfront conservation rights and insisted the community now collectively managed lake access. It didn't matter that my deed said otherwise. It didn't matter that I'd lived peacefully there for nearly a year without a single complaint. They had drawn their line in the dirt, and worse, they had done it because they thought I wouldn't fight. They didn't know me. They didn't know what I had seen or what I had learned in the quietest, darkest parts of the world. They didn't know the parts of me that had been forged in places with no electricity, no running water, and no margin for fear. I had wanted peace, but if they wouldn't allow it, I was prepared for something else. That night, I sat on the steps of my back porch, bourbon in hand, looking out past the new fence toward the glimmer of water just beyond. It looked different now, less like a haven, more like a prize someone had stolen. I sipped the bourbon and whispered to the night, "They don't know what they've started." And they truly didn't, because while they had blocked my path to the lake, they had no idea I still held the key to the water itself. I didn't sleep that night. The memory of that smug padlock swinging on the fence stayed in my mind, replaying over and over like a movie scene I couldn't shut off. It wasn't just the fence. It was what it stood for, a line drawn in the sand. A challenge, a message, we decide what's yours. I wasn't the kind of man who reacted with rage. Discipline had been carved into me by years of command, of watching men break under pressure while I held the line. But there was a different kind of anger, growing in my chest, now the quiet kind, the kind that simmers and calculates. The next morning, I walked the full edge of my backyard, surveying the new barrier they had erected. It ran the entire length of my rear property, blocking all access to the narrow trail that led down to the dock. They hadn't even done it neatly. The posts were crooked, the mesh sagged in places, but the padlock was new, shiny, and tight. I took pictures, detailed ones, wide shots, close-ups, even a time-stamped video where I narrated every section of the fence and pointed to the surveyor stakes I had installed when I moved in. The markers were still there, plastic flags, half buried in the soil right where the county had put them. Right where the deed said my land ended, which, for the record, was halfway into the lake. After documenting everything, I pulled out the original property survey again. My hands still had the muscle memory for topographic maps, and the ink was just as clear as I remembered. My land included lake access. My land included the slope, the trail, and the shoreline. The HOA's updated maps weren't just wrong, they were fabricated. I drove straight to the county records office. The clerk, a woman named Deidre, was patient as I laid the two maps side by side, mine from the 1970s, with multiple recertifications, and they're stamped by a private HOA consultant just 3 months ago. She leaned in, frowning. "This one's official," she said, tapping my survey. "It's in our database, last updated 8 years ago after a boundary reconfirmation. And the HOA one," she squinted, "this isn't on file with the county. This looks internal. So they just drew their own map and built a fence on my land." "I can't speak to that," she said carefully. "But if you're asking whether this is your land, yes, it is." I thanked her and drove home, fury sharpening into clarity. I now had proof. I had confirmation. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't wrong. They had stepped onto my land and claimed it as theirs. Still, I didn't take a sledgehammer to the fence, not yet. I wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of labeling me as unstable or hostile. I knew the game they were playing. They wanted me to react with emotion to make a mistake. But I'd spent a lifetime in places where mistakes cost lives. This would cost them something else. I started documenting everything, every letter, every interaction, every visit from the HOA's landscape enforcement team. I even installed my own set of cameras positioned to record the fence line and my dock, or what I could see of it from behind their blockade. 1 week later, another letter arrived. It was folded neatly and taped to my front door, not mailed taped. That was the first red flag. Inside, a $500 fine. Violation, unauthorized use of community shoreline. I laughed out loud. The accusation was laughable, of course. I hadn't touched the lake in weeks, couldn't, thanks to their padlock. But the language in the letter was clever. They claimed that a neighbor had seen me loitering beyond the fence line, possibly intending to use restricted access. It was vague, manipulative, and absurd. Still, they were playing the paper trail game. I understood the tactic. They were trying to build a file, a case, a pattern of noncompliance, something to weaponize against me down the line. So I did what any strategist would do. I kept quiet, and I kept gathering intel. I also started talking quietly to neighbors. The first was Jerry, a retired engineer who lived 2 doors down and had been there for 15 years. He remembered when the original dock was built. He even had pictures, old ones printed on glossy Kodak paper, of him and his grandkids fishing from that dock. That's your dock, he told me, always has been. HOA's full of it. He told me stories of Charlene Dunn, the president, and her rise to power through a combination of backdoor votes and browbeating, of how she'd redefined boundaries in shared spaces without votes, of how she used her husband's law degree as a shield and her smile as a weapon. She once fined me for unapproved outdoor lighting because I put up Christmas lights that weren't white, Jerry said. The HOA is her kingdom. I nodded. Well, the kingdom just annexed part of my land. He looked at me for a long moment, then leaned in. You thinking of fighting this? I don't start fights, I said, but I end them. He smiled. Let me know if you need those pictures. I've got the negatives too. I thanked him and walked back home. The air smelled like pine and distant water, but it didn't feel like peace anymore. It felt like tension, like something smoldering beneath the surface, waiting to erupt. That afternoon, I received another HOA letter, this time certified. They were demanding I remove my dock within 10 days. Their reasoning, unauthorized structure extending into community-managed waters. It was bold, stupid even. And that told me one thing: they were scared. They were trying to erase the evidence before I could escalate the issue legally. The problem was they didn't know I had already escalated it. The next day, I contacted a lawyer, not just any lawyer. Her name was Naomi Klein, and she specialized in property disputes and HOA litigation. I'd met her years ago when she was still interning for a JAG officer I worked with. She remembered me. When I showed her the documents, the photos, the certified property lines, she nodded slowly. They're bluffing, she said, but they're dangerous because they think no one will push back. And they've probably done this before. She drafted a formal cease and desist letter that same afternoon. We cited county records, state boundary law, the original survey, and HOA overreach precedent. It was a beautiful, sharp-edged thing, clean, professional, and unforgiving. We hand-delivered it to the HOA office ourselves. Charlene wasn't there, of course. Her assistant, a nervous young man named Brent, accepted it with trembling fingers. Tell her I said that she's not the only one who knows how to write letters. And just like that, the war was no longer quiet. By the time I returned home from the HOA office, I already knew I had crossed an invisible line, the kind that doesn't make a sound when you step over it, but you feel it settle across your shoulders like the weight of incoming weather. The cease and desist letter wasn't just a challenge. It was the first real blow in a fight I hadn't started, but one I sure as hell intended to finish. I sat on the back porch that evening, staring through the chain-link fence they'd installed. The lake shimmered beyond it, teasing me, reflecting soft amber streaks from the setting sun. It used to feel like mine, not in the possessive way HOA board members cling to bylaws and uniform shrub heights, but in the quiet, sacred way something becomes yours after it witnesses your grief. That lake had seen my mourning, my silence, the healing bourbon in my hand, and the whispered words to my wife as I stood on the dock we never got to share. Now it was divided by galvanized steel and padlocks reduced to territory. But I had a plan, and it started with maps, real ones. Early the next morning, I drove to the municipal archives, tucked into an unassuming brick building downtown. It was the kind of place where dust and silence lived in harmony, where history was boxed and stacked like forgotten treasure. I met with an archivist named Herman, an older gentleman who smelled of pipe tobacco and wore fingerless gloves even in the spring. When I explained what I was looking for, historical plats of Stillwater Lake and the adjacent parcels, he nodded slowly and led me to a back room. There, under buzzing fluorescent lights, he rolled out blueprints and yellowed surveyor sketches on a long wooden table. It didn't take long to find what I needed. Herman unrolled a wide sheet, dated 1972. Stillwater Lake was smaller back then, just a natural basin fed by 2 underground springs and drained by a narrow creek that flowed south toward the city. My parcel lot 19B was clearly marked, the boundaries extending not only to the lake, but slightly into it. The dock area was specifically labeled private access easement deeded with parcel. This one here, Herman tapped with a shaky finger, is recorded in the original deed book long before the HOA ever existed. That was the key. The HOA, I already knew, had been formed in 1998, nearly 30 years after the subdivision was carved from private land and rezoned into a preserved community. But their own maps, the ones they used to assert power, had quietly overwritten that history. In their version, the lake was a common asset. In reality, it had been partially private all along, with riparian rights granted to specific properties, including mine. Riparian rights. I chewed on the phrase for a moment. The legal doctrine gave landowners who bordered water bodies the right to access and reasonably use the water as long as it didn't interfere with others' use. In this case, my dock was legal, my shoreline access was deeded, and the fence erected without my consent was the actual violation. "You mind if I make a copy?" I asked Herman. He shook his head, already wheeling the blueprint over to the copy machine. As I left, he called after me, "They rewrite the maps when no one's looking. But paper remembers. Old maps always tell the truth." I thanked him. Armed with the historical documents and my legal deed, I returned home to find a voicemail on my phone. It was from Brent, the HOA assistant. "Mr. Walker," he said, voice strained. "Charlene wanted me to inform you that the board will not be responding to your letter at this time. Any further communication should be directed through legal counsel." Translation: they were scared, but they weren't backing off. They were doubling down. That became clear 3 days later when I woke up to find an envelope shoved under my front door. Inside was a violation notice again, but this time, it was printed on bright red paper like a warning flare. The letter accused me of trespassing on protected community property, citing anonymous witnesses who claimed I had entered the restricted dock area after dark. It was nonsense. My cameras, which I had mounted on the back deck, would easily disprove it. Still, the message was obvious. They were watching me. They were escalating, and they didn't care about truth, only control. So I turned my attention to something far more interesting: the water. Stillwater Lake, for all its beauty, was not a natural lake. It was a man-made reservoir created decades ago by a now-defunct development company that had dammed a small spring-fed stream. The lake's shape, depth, and flow were all human constructs, and like all human constructs, they could be altered. I started researching the hydrology of the area. Thanks to a few public records and some well-placed questions at the environmental office downtown, I learned that my property sat at the northernmost tip of the original creek bed. In fact, the original overflow channel, a narrow ditch designed to prevent flooding during storms, still existed buried beneath layers of silt and brush. That channel led to a retention pond downstream, one the HOA had mostly ignored because it sat just beyond their official boundary. Here's the twist: because the overflow ditch was technically on my land, and because it connected to a natural drainage system, I had the legal right to restore it, not to harm the lake, of course, but to protect my property from potential water encroachment. It was called defensive hydrological maintenance, a mouthful, but exactly the legal phrase Naomi later confirmed would hold up in court. The idea was simple. If they were going to block my access to the lake access, I was legally entitled to, then I would shift the battlefield not out of revenge, but out of logic. If the HOA wanted to weaponize land, I would use water. And so I called in a friend. His name was Luis Calderon, a civil engineer I had served with during a 2-year deployment in South America. Luis had a genius-level mind and a low tolerance for bureaucracy. When I explained the situation over the phone, he didn't hesitate. "Let's walk it," he said. "You buy the beers." Luis arrived that Saturday with topographic maps, a laser level, and a backpack full of survey tools. We spent hours tracing the property lines, measuring the slope of the land, and identifying the path of the buried overflow ditch. Sure enough, the ground still bore the faint scar of the old drainage system. "Your land," Luis confirmed, pointing at the channel. "Your right to maintain it. And based on slope analysis, reopening this ditch would divert about 12 to 15% of the lake's inflow. Not enough to cause damage, but enough to shrink the lake." I didn't smile, not yet, but I felt it, an ember of quiet satisfaction. "I don't want to hurt the ecosystem," I said. "I just wanted to make a point." "But I don't want to hurt the ecosystem," Luis said, nodding. "Then we'll do it the right way. No machinery, just a restoration. Just a restoration. Nature helping itself." We filed a maintenance notification with a 2 days later, the local watershed authority. 2 days later, no permit needed. It was a formality, really, because the ditch predated most modern regulations, and because it lay entirely on my property, no permit was needed. Naomi reviewed the paperwork and gave her blessing. "It's your land," she said. "Let them try to argue against gravity." The following week we began. Armed with shovels, pickaxes, and sweat, Luis and I dug out the old channel foot by foot. We removed roots, cleared debris, and redirected a small feeder stream through the ditch, allowing water to flow naturally once more. It wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden whoosh, no floodgate moment, just a slow, steady trickle, like the beginning of a whisper. But sometimes whispers become roars. By the end of the week, the water line on the far side of the lake, the HOA clubhouse side, had dropped by 2 inches. By the next, it was 4, and the view from their fancy lakeside lounge, well, it was getting just a little dry. By the end of the 3rd week, the water line on the HOA's side of the lake had visibly receded. It wasn't dramatic yet, but it was undeniable. Their manicured shoreline now revealed muddy roots and sun-bleached rocks that hadn't seen daylight in years. The dock that jutted out from the clubhouse, usually resting flush with the surface, now hovered awkwardly above the water, its shadow stretching across dry gravel. I didn't gloat, I didn't smile, but I did notice that Charlene Dunn had stopped waving when she drove past my house. I had no illusions. This was not over. It wasn't even close. The HOA was not an enemy to be defeated in one strike. It was a bureaucracy, a hydra, with smiling heads and paperwork for fangs. And true to form, their response wasn't direct retaliation. It was subtler, more insidious. They buried me in violations. The letters came daily, sometimes 2 at a time. Yellow paper, red paper, even one printed on thick ivory cardstock, like it was a wedding invitation to a battle. Violations ranged from the absurd, excessive bird feeder activity to the Orwellian, unauthorized soil displacement near community watershed. Each carried a fine, a deadline, and a thinly veiled threat of further legal action. I stacked the letters in a neat pile on the kitchen counter held together by a rubber band. Naomi reviewed each one with a tired smirk and logged them into our formal complaint. "They're trying to overwhelm you," she said, "flood you with paper, force you to react emotionally. But it's all noise. They've got resources," I said, sipping coffee from a chipped mug. "They're betting I'll run out of stamina." Naomi nodded. "Then we beat them at their own game, bury them back." She filed a countersuit. It wasn't a full lawsuit yet, just a formal notice of intent to litigate based on documented property violations, harassment, and defamation. We cited the bogus fines, the trespass by fence, the HOA's unauthorized map alterations, and their refusal to recognize pre-existing riparian rights. We attached the county's own maps, Herman's certified copies, and Luis's hydrological report showing the lake's natural flow pattern. But most importantly, we included one photo. It was a panoramic shot taken from my back deck showing the water gently flowing into the newly restored drainage channel, peaceful, legal ironic. Naomi sent the packet via certified mail email and courier, no room for denial. The next morning, Charlene knocked on my door. She didn't smile. "I'd like to discuss your recent actions," she said stiffly, standing on my front step like a queen surveying a serf. She wore a blazer, pearls, and an expression somewhere between threat and desperation. "You can speak to my attorney," I replied calmly. "I don't think escalation is necessary," she said, her eyes darting towards my yard. "We're neighbors after all." I let the silence stretch. The birds chirped. Somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower hummed. "I'll give you one opportunity," she said, finally breaking. "Reseal the drainage channel. Restore the water level, and the board will consider dropping all pending fines." I stared at her. It was the first real crack in her polished facade. She wasn't asking out of diplomacy. She was asking out of fear. "You trespassed on my land," I said. "You blocked my access. You vandalized my dock and falsified property maps. The only reason you're here now is because your lawn chairs no longer have a lake to face." She flushed just slightly. "I suggest you prepare for court," I said, then closed the door. That week, the water line dropped again. It wasn't dramatic, but it was enough that the HOA began receiving complaints not just from me, but from other homeowners, the ones with expensive properties along the South Bank, the ones who hadn't cared when Charlene built a fence across my access, but now found themselves staring at dried cattails instead of rippling blue. One of them, a man named Richard Grove, came knocking a few days later. He wore a fishing vest and frustration. "Mr. Walker," he said, "you used to sit out on that dock of yours. My wife and I admired that. You always looked peaceful." I said nothing. I heard rumors, he continued, glancing toward the ditch. that now trickled like a hidden stream that you might have done something to the water flow. I legally restored a drainage channel on my land, I said. Nothing more. He rubbed the back of his neck. Well, it's certainly affecting things. Our shoreline has shifted almost 3 feet. So has mine, I replied. Difference is, I didn't start this. He looked at me for a long moment, then sighed. Just, if there's a way to fix this without dragging everyone into a lawsuit, maybe it's worth talking. You know where to find me, I said. I watched him walk away, another thread in the fabric beginning to fray. Charlene retaliated again. This time, she sent out a community newsletter. It was carefully worded, full of vague language and passive-aggressive phrasing. Due to uncoordinated modifications by a resident, the lake's levels have experienced temporary fluctuation, and your HOA board is working tirelessly to address challenges caused by unauthorized land alterations. But the best line, the board is committed to preserving the natural beauty of Stillwater Lake and asks all residents to remain calm while we pursue all necessary remedies. It read like propaganda, and like all propaganda, it didn't work on people who'd already lost something. The next neighborhood meeting was the turning point. It was held in the clubhouse, the one with the now dry dock. I wasn't planning to attend, but Naomi encouraged me. Go, she said. Let them see you. Let them ask questions. The truth doesn't need a lawyer to speak. So I went. I wore my old navy peacoat, not out of ceremony, but because it was cold, and I liked the weight of it. The room was packed more than usual, not the polite tea and crackers crowd either. This was homeowners with skin in the game, people whose property values were tied to the water they could no longer see from their windows. Charlene stood at the front, flanked by Brent and 2 other board members. She tried to open with pleasantries, but tension clung to the room like fog. Then someone raised their hand. Is it true you built a fence on Mr. Walker's land? A hush. Charlene's smile faltered. The board made adjustments for community safety. But is it his land? Someone else pressed. Charlene fumbled. The maps were updated to reflect. What about the drainage ditch? Was he within his rights? That's when I stood up. I didn't shout. I didn't rant. I simply explained the facts, the original deed, the archival maps, the riparian rights, the county records, the legal restoration of the drainage ditch. I even brought copies of the surveyor's documents for anyone who wanted to see them. I never wanted a fight, I said, but I won't be pushed off my own land. I served this country 4 decades. I buried my wife with dreams of living quietly by the water. That dream was taken from me not by accident, but by design. And I'm standing here now not to escalate, but to remind you all this community belongs to the people, not the paperwork. The room was silent for a long beat. Then someone clapped, then another, and then the dam cracked, not the literal one, but the social one. Voices rose. Questions flew. Charlene tried to regain control, but it was too late. The HOA had overplayed their hand, and now even their allies were questioning everything. As I left the clubhouse that night, I heard murmurs. Not about violations or fines, but about votes, about removals, about taking back control. The war was far from over, but the tide had turned. The lake was a mirror. The morning they destroyed it, still glassy. A thin layer of mist coiling across the surface like breath on a cold window pane. It was too early, and I was sitting on the porch with my usual mug of black coffee when I noticed the noise metal against wood, muffled thuds, the sound of labor. I stood confused. It wasn't garbage day. It wasn't construction. And then I saw them, 3 men in fluorescent safety vests huddled at the end of my dock, dismantling it. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming or losing my mind. But then one of the workers took a crowbar and pried a plank loose, tossing it casually into a wheelbarrow like it was nothing more than trash. I shouted before I realized I was moving. The mug hit the porch with a shatter. My boots thundered across the lawn. Hey! They paused. One of them looked up startled, as if I had interrupted something perfectly routine. What the hell are you doing? I demanded. The man with the crowbar shrugged. Work order from the HOA, he said. Said to remove an unauthorized structure. That's my dock. He didn't argue. He just looked away, gestured to the others, and went back to prying boards. I moved to step past the fence, my fence which they had installed, and I had not yet removed for strategic legal reasons, but the padlock was still there, gleaming in the morning sun like an insult. My hands gripped the metal links. You're trespassing, I shouted. This is private property. One of the men paused, pulled out a folded paper from his vest. We got a permit signed by Charlene Dunn. He handed it over through the fence, almost apologetically. I scanned it quickly. It wasn't a permit. It was a typed letterhead from the HOA board stating the dock violated community codes and posed a safety risk, no county signature, no city authorization, no inspection seal, meaning it was worthless. I called the police, and for once, they came quickly. 2 officers arrived in under 10 minutes. One of them, Officer Ramirez, had been stationed at the same base as me back in the late 90s. He recognized me immediately and shook my hand. "Talk to me," he said. I explained the situation, showed the deed, the survey, the documentation. He listened, nodding, while his partner walked down to speak to the workers. They stopped prying boards as soon as the uniforms arrived. "They say the HOA hired them," Officer Ramirez said, "but they don't have municipal clearance, no work permit, no official complaint on file." "Then I want to press charges," I said. "Destruction of private property." He exhaled through his nose. "You'll need to file a report. We'll include witness statements, but I can't arrest them today." "Why not?" "Because technically, they were told they had authority by a governing body. We need to sort it out in court." "Then I want it all documented." I said. "Every board they pulled, every nail they ripped." He nodded. "I'll make sure of it." The workers stopped, packed up their tools, left the dock half ruined, and walked back toward their unmarked pickup truck. No apologies, no remorse, just another job. But as they drove away, I looked down at the water line, now lapping gently against exposed nails and splintered beams. The dock I had stood on with bourbon in hand, whispering to my wife in the night, was broken, torn apart not by nature but by paper and power. I didn't cry. I don't cry often. But that night I sat on the edge of the broken trail, feet dangling near the edge, and let the ache sit in my chest like an anvil. They hadn't just removed wood and nails. They'd torn away something sacred. Naomi was livid. "They didn't even file a notice," she said, pacing my kitchen. "No court order, no warning, nothing but HOA letterhead and audacity." I handed her the paper they gave me. She scanned it and rolled her eyes. "This is a joke. This is an invitation to a lawsuit." "We were filing already," I reminded her. "Now we escalate," she replied. "They want to play this publicly? Fine. Let's show the city what Stillwater HOA is really doing." The next week was a flurry of action. We filed a formal complaint with the city's zoning department, another with the Department of Environmental Resources, and a third with the State Attorney General's HOA Oversight Division. Naomi also filed a tort claim against the HOA itself, civil destruction of property, trespassing, and intentional emotional harm. Then came the photos. I took dozens before, during, after. I documented every broken board, every exposed bolt. I took close-ups of the signatures on their fraudulent work order. I printed out the emails, the certified letters, the cease and desists they ignored. But it was the video that really broke it open. One of my trail cameras had captured the whole thing from the first crowbar swing to the moment the workers saw the police arrive, clear as day. I sent it to the local news station anonymously. A week later, it aired during the 6 o'clock report, sandwiched between school board elections and a lost dog segment. Residents question HOA overreach after veterans' private dock is dismantled without permit. The story spread like a brush fire. Within 2 days, I got calls from reporters from other residents, even from an HOA board member I had never spoken to. A man named Peter Langford, mild-mannered, polite, one of the few board members who hadn't seemed actively hostile, called to say he was concerned about the direction things were going. "You should have thought about that before you let Charlene off the leash," I said. "She doesn't speak for all of us." "No," I agreed, "but she's dragging all of you down with her." He went quiet. "I'm not doing this for revenge," I added. "I just want my damn land back, my peace, that's all." He thanked me and hung up. The next day, I got a letter from Charlene herself. No red ink, this time. No passive-aggressive phrasing, just a plain envelope and a single-typed page. It read, "Mr. Walker, the board acknowledges receipt of your complaints and has agreed to schedule a mediation session to resolve current disputes. Please confirm availability. Charlene Dunn, President Stillwater, HOA." It was the closest thing to an apology I was going to get. I didn't respond. Instead, I printed the letter, tacked it to the wall next to the photo of my destroyed dock, and wrote underneath it in pen. They blinked first, but I wasn't finished. They had taken something precious from me. Now I was going to take something bigger from them, not out of spite, but out of necessity. Their illusion of control. And I would do it with the one thing they feared most: proof. The house was quiet, in the way I liked. No ringing phones, no HOA envelopes. At the door, no buzz of lawnmowers from neighbors trying to one-up each other's grass length, just the creak of the old wood floors under my boots, and the occasional groan of the house settling as I brewed my coffee and stared out at what was left of my dock. I didn't feel defeated, far from it. What they didn't understand was that I had lived in places far worse than this had stared down enemies who didn't hide behind bylaws and newsletters. I'd negotiated peace in villages with no electricity and held dying soldiers in my arms as dust storms swallowed the horizon. HOA politics. This was nothing. It was just another mission. But this time I wouldn't need bullets. I needed water, and I knew just the man for it. I called Luis again. Remember that idea we tossed around about 2 beers into the ditch project? He laughed. The water routing one. Yeah, I want to explore it. He arrived 2 days later in a white Tacoma with survey gear piled in the back seat and a cooler full of Negra Modelo. We stood at the edge of the now functional drainage ditch that gently carried water away from my shoreline. Here's what we've got, he said, unrolling new satellite imagery and topographic prints on my kitchen table. There are 3 key inflows into Stillwater Lake, 2 from the spring-fed marsh up north, and 1 artificial retention basin the HOA built 10 years ago as part of their clubhouse expansion. You remember that? I did. They bragged about it in one of their newsletters. It was supposed to beautify the lake's ecology and serve as a community irrigation backup, whatever that meant. Now, Luis continued tracing lines with a red pen. Your property sits at the highest natural point on the northern inlet. That means you're not just above the HOA clubhouse side of the lake, you're upstream of them. If we increase flow through this drainage channel, we reduce their water level faster. Legally. Totally, he said. Especially if we document it as water mitigation, fire risk reduction, soil stability, overflow, prevention, you name it. There's a half-dozen state grants that support this kind of work. So you're saying I can dry out their view by doing responsible land management? Exactly. I stared at the map, then looked outside at the sun beginning to dip over the pines. The sky reflected orange all across the surface of the lake, casting long shadows where my dock used to be. Let's do it, I said. We spent the next 2 weeks methodically deepening the channel, not by digging a canyon, but by restoring the natural contours the HOA had ignored for decades. Luis was a genius with flow modeling. He adjusted the slope of the ditch using just a transit level and muscle memory, redirecting storm runoff to move water faster without overwhelming the landscape. To anyone else, it looked like landscaping. To the HOA, it was silent sabotage. We installed erosion control logs, lined the banks with native plants, and documented everything. Naomi helped draft a public-facing report, Private Landowner Restores Native Drainage to Prevent Downstream Flooding. We even submitted it to the local watershed council, who praised it as a model of responsible stewardship. Charlene's silence said everything. But it wasn't just silence, it was pressure. Within days of filing the report, HOA board members began showing up on my property's edge. Not trespassing, not officially, but observing. 2 of them lingered by the drainage channel one afternoon until I walked outside with my phone recording. Afternoon, I called. You folks enjoying the view? They muttered something about concern for runoff and backed away. Later that night, Luis and I stood on the porch with a couple cold ones and watched the lake level drop another inch. This is beautiful, he murmured. Water doesn't scream, it just leaves. The fallout began slowly. Emails circulated among HOA members, some of which were forwarded anonymously to Naomi. Residents along the south side were growing frustrated lawn, irrigation pumps were sputtering, boat launches were grounding on silt. The clubhouse fountain shut off entirely. Charlene, of course, blamed me. She sent out another newsletter, this one with bold red text. Environmental sabotage threatens community resources. It accused an unnamed homeowner of diverting water, harming shared ecosystems, and violating HOA unity. I framed it right next to my Navy commendation. Because here's what Charlene didn't know. I had friends. The city manager, for one. I'd saved his brother's life 15 years ago in Fallujah. I didn't cash in that favor lightly, but I did invite him out for coffee. We sat at a diner outside the HOA jurisdiction, and I laid out my case, the surveys, the letters, the photos, the videos, the dock, the drainage, the fence. He didn't speak much, just nodded. Then he looked at me and said, "You want me to blow this up?" "No," I replied. "I want them to blink. I want them to back off quietly. I want my damn lake, and I want them to leave me alone." He nodded. I'll have some folks look into their construction permits, maybe see if that clubhouse addition passed environmental review like they claim. He didn't promise anything. But 2 days later, the city issued a surprise inspection on the HOA's retention basin. And wouldn't you know it, they found violations improper, grading overflow, risk unpermitted, pipe extensions. Charlene screamed foul, but it didn't matter. The inspectors were just doing their jobs. The HOA had to shut down their basin operations until they could comply with state regulations. That meant no more artificial inflow into the lake, which meant no replenishment on their side. And just like that, the water kept flowing away. People started talking. Neighbors who had once looked away now walked past my house with curious expressions. Some offered nods, some whispered. A few bold enough even asked questions. Is it true you own part of the lake? Yes. Is it true they tore down your dock? Also yes. Did you really divert the water? I just smiled. I'm just managing my land. One neighbor, a retired nurse named Clara, brought over banana bread. Charlene fined me last year because I put a little free library in my yard, she said, setting the loaf down on my table. I hope you keep going. I didn't reply, but I thanked her for the bread. And that night, I stood in the moonlight near the trickling ditch, watching as the water whispered its way southward, away from the people who had tried to own it. They had thought they were fighting a lonely man. What they didn't understand was this: a man alone is not always isolated. Sometimes he's just waiting. A month after we restored the drainage channel, the HOA's side of the lake looked like someone had pulled the plug in a bathtub. It was subtle at first, a ring of muddy shoreline around their once pristine waterfront, a sluggish current, a hint of algae where clear water once shimmered, but now the change was undeniable. On my side, nature was thriving. The plants Luis and I had placed along the drainage bank were blooming with early summer wildflowers. Frogs nested in the shallow pools. Birds chirped from new willow shoots. It looked less like landscaping and more like healing. But across the lake, things were beginning to rot. I watched as the HOA's clubhouse fountain remained eerily dry for the third week straight. Their event deck, once boasting lakefront views for sunset weddings and donor galas, now overlooked a sad patch of cracked mud dragonflies flitting between puddles. The residents started grumbling louder. I could hear them during walks to the mailbox. Why's the lake look so low? It's hurting our home values. Didn't we pay for a new irrigation system? Where the hell is Charlene? And Charlene, while she was spinning like a weather vane in a hurricane, she sent out more letters, more emergency HOA bulletins, using phrases like unforeseen hydrological disturbance and localized water redistribution. At no point did she admit what she knew what everyone was beginning to understand. She had poked the wrong bear, and that bear had figured out the plumbing, but she wasn't going to take it lying down. One morning, I opened my mailbox and found a large manila envelope with a law firm's name, stamped across the corner Baker Grint and Alden, LLP. Inside was a cease and desist letter addressed to me accusing me of willfully altering natural water flow, interfering with shared ecological assets, and my favorite, causing undue emotional distress to fellow community members through topographical manipulation. I nearly laughed. It was an inch thick, padded with pseudo-scientific jargon and legal threats clearly meant to intimidate. But Naomi had trained me to spot the difference between legal fact and legal theater. I brought it to her office that afternoon. She read the first 2 paragraphs and set it aside like a smelly napkin. Classic bluff, she said. They're trying to scare you into shutting the channel. What's their endgame? Force you into a settlement. Admit partial fault. Close the ditch, accept some gag order, so Charlene doesn't have to explain why half the lake looks like a dehydrated sandbox. She glanced back at the letter. And emotional distress through topographical manipulation. That's the most HOA sentence I've ever read. We drafted a formal reply and sent it by courier. It was short, including certified documentation from the city hydrology department, confirming my drainage ditch restoration was legal and beneficial. It cited my riparian rights again, then closed with a single sentence. Further legal harassment will be viewed as retaliation for protected landowner activity and will be addressed in court accordingly. That same week, I received a formal invitation to a mandatory HOA hearing. Topic: disruption of community harmony. I showed up not because I respected the process, but because I wanted them to see my face. The hearing was held in the clubhouse conference room, now faintly smelling of mildew from the stagnant air and sunken shoreline. Charlene sat at the center of the table, like a dethroned monarch, flanked by 3 other board members who looked increasingly less confident than the last time I'd seen them. She cleared her throat. "Mr. Walker, we've received multiple complaints." I cut her off. "Before you go on, I have a question." She blinked. "This is a board hearing. You'll have time to speak at the end." "No," I said evenly now. A murmur rose from the back of the room. Several residents had come to watch. Some were holding copies of the newsletters. One man even had a printout of the news article that aired last month. "I want to know who authorized the destruction of my dock," I said. Charlene shifted in her seat. "The board acted in the interest of—" "I'm not asking for a philosophy," I said. "I'm asking for a name." A pause. Then a board member to her left, Peter Langford, the same man who had called me weeks ago, spoke up. "It was Charlene," he said quietly. "She didn't consult the board." Charlene turned on him like a snake. "Excuse me." Peter didn't flinch. "You told the workers it was approved. We never voted. You acted alone." Gasps, audible ones. A woman in the back even said, "Is that true?" I stood still, not smiling, not gloating, just watching the dam begin to crack. Charlene's voice rose. "The dock violated community aesthetics. It posed a safety risk." "According to you," Peter said. I stepped forward. "Your board violated property law. You trespassed. You destroyed private infrastructure. You then tried to intimidate me with junk lawsuits and fake charges. You lied about maps, fabricated violations, and now you're watching the consequences play out in your own backyard." The room was silent. "This hearing," I said, "isn't about community harmony. It's about control, and you're losing it." Charlene was flushed, breathing hard. She looked around for support, but found only lowered gazes. I turned to the crowd. "Ask yourselves one question. If it was your dock, your fence, your land, would you let her get away with it?" Nobody spoke, because everyone already knew the answer. I left the meeting without waiting for a verdict. 2 days later, the HOA dropped all pending fines against me, rescinded the hearing notice, and sent a new letter, a formal request for mediation to avoid prolonged community disruption. It was the clearest signal yet. They were retreating. But I wasn't done, because retreat without reform meant they'd do it again to someone else. A new neighbor, a single mom, an elderly couple, someone without maps or military training or friends in the city planning office. No, I didn't want an apology. I wanted change, so I made a call. The local news station was still interested. They'd run a follow-up, a second segment, Veterans HOA Warships Power Balance in Lakeside Community. They wanted interviews, drone footage, before and after shots, and I gave it to them. We filmed for 2 hours. I walked them through the ruined dock, the fenced access, the restored ditch, and the lake's shrunken south side. Naomi spoke on record. Louis showed his water flow models. But the moment that stayed with me was when the reporter asked, "Why did you go this far?" And I said without rehearsing, because silence is how bullies win, I just made some noise. After the second news segment aired, everything changed again. But this time, it wasn't just my quiet corner of Stillwater Lake that was buzzing. People from other HOA-controlled communities started reaching out to Naomi. We received messages from residents 2 towns over complaining of eerily similar abuses. Mysterious fines, arbitrary enforcement, phantom safety concerns used as pretext for power plays. Charlene had tried to control a lake, but now her little kingdom had become a case study in what happens when you pick the wrong fight. And yet, just when I thought she'd finally back down, regroup, or even resign, she came back swinging. This time with lawyers. Real ones. A thick envelope landed at Naomi's office. Midweek, a formal complaint filed in civil court. The HOA, under Charlene's signature, was suing me for environmental interference, property devaluation, and intentional diminishment of shared resources. "I've seen bad filings," Naomi muttered, flipping through the stack, "but this is malicious." They had taken every single action I made, clearing my drainage ditch, submitting restoration paperwork, even providing interviews to the press, and twisted them into accusations of sabotage. They claimed I'd single-handedly destabilized the Stillwater ecosystem, and most galling of all, caused irreparable psychological harm to lakefront residents deprived of water views. I stared at that last line for a long moment. My jaw didn't clench, my pulse didn't rise. But deep down, something clicked. They were scared, really scared, because this wasn't about ecology. It was about optics. Charlene was bleeding credibility, and in her desperation, she thought that filing a lawsuit would shift the narrative, make me look like the villain, the man who dried out the lake, who broke the neighborhood, who weaponized water. Naomi prepared our defense with military precision. We countersued. Our claim wasn't just a defense. It was a direct accusation, targeted harassment, trespassing, destruction of private property, abuse of power, defamation. We included every HOA letter, every fine, every unauthorized action, every unauthorized letter. And we added one more exhibit, an affidavit from Peter Langford. Yes, Peter. After that disastrous HOA hearing, he'd quietly stepped away from the board, but not before reaching out to Naomi before. I want to help, he said. I saw what I saw, and I should have spoken up sooner. His affidavit confirmed everything that Charlene had acted alone, unilaterally, that she had forged a board consensus, that she had knowingly violated property lines to send a message, and we sent it knowing it was illegal violation of property lines. The case went public within a week, and the fallout was swift. First, the City Council issued a statement announcing a review of all HOA practices in all nearby areas districts. Then, the Environmental Oversight Board issued a citation against the HOA for unauthorized construction and shoreline interference with on their clubhouse side. Turns out their fancy retention basin hadn't just been improperly graded, it had been violated multiple runoff protocols for years. The irony was rich. They tried and sued me for hurting the lake, and were sued by the state for it. The state then hit them for it instead. Charlene's lawyers tried one last maneuver, a request for an emergency injunction, to force me to close the drainage ditch until trial. Naomi responded with a 47-page rebuttal that cited everything from historical land deeds to modern watershed law. The judge denied their motion. Mr. Walker has acted within his legal rights to maintain drainage on his private property, the order read. The HOA's actions present a pattern of retaliatory governance. Boom! The final nail in their procedural coffin. And then, just like that, the dominoes fell. Charlene was asked to step down. The request came via an anonymous vote of no confidence from within the board. Peter told me they had gathered just enough signatures from residents who were sick of Fine's secrecy and the slow suffocation of community trust. The following newsletter had a very different tone. Stillwater HOA Board announcement. Effective immediately, Charlene Dunn has voluntarily resigned as president. We thank her for her service and will be initiating a community-wide forum to discuss leadership reform and neighborhood values. It was the most graceful way of saying we're done with her that I'd ever read. A few days later, I saw her packing up her SUV carrying a box of HOA binders and wind chimes. She didn't look at me. I didn't wave. There was nothing left to say. But I watched her drive away, not because I hated her, I didn't. I watched. Because in some twisted way, I knew how hard it must be to let go of control when it's all you ever believed gave you power. She had tied her identity to the HOA, like it was her last grip on relevance. I didn't envy her. I just pitied her. But I had no time for pity, not now. Because with the storm cleared, the cleanup could begin. The new interim board, led by Peter and two other residents with actual integrity, reached out to me for help, not with governance. I had no interest in running for office, but they wanted input feedback on how to restore what had been broken, not just the lake, but the community. I agreed under one condition. I want the fence down, I said. And I want the dock rebuilt. Peter nodded. We'll make it right. They did. It took 2 weeks, some volunteers, and one very enthusiastic Eagle Scout troop, but they removed every trace of the chain link eyesore that once cut across my property line. The dock. They rebuilt it from scratch, cedar planks weather-treated wider than the original, stronger too. I stepped onto it the day it was finished. The wood was smooth beneath my boots. The lake, now gently replenished after a few late spring storms, lapped peacefully against the shoreline. The community held a small ceremony the next day. They didn't call it an apology, but it was one. Neighbors I had never spoken to came forward with handshakes, food, and thank yous. Clara brought more banana bread. Richard Grove, the man in the fishing vest, gave me a new rod with a handwritten note for the one who reminded us the lake is for everyone. Luis was there too. He stood next to me at the edge of the dock, sipping a beer. You planning on charging admission next time, he joked. I smiled. Nah, but I'll be damn sure no one ever tries to steal this view again. We stood there in silence, as the sun dipped below the tree line, casting golden ripples across the water. A lake was never just a lake. It was peace. It was memory. It was home. And now finally it was mine again. The morning after the ceremony, I stood on my newly rebuilt dock, barefoot, feeling the coolness of the cedar planks beneath my feet. A light breeze rippled across the lake, carrying the scent of pine and fresh water. It had been a long time since I felt this kind of calm. Not just around me, but inside me. For months, I had fought a quiet war, one waged with bylaws instead of bullets, with maps instead of minefields. I hadn't sought this conflict, but I hadn't shied away from it either. The dock beneath me was more than just a platform. It was a monument to endurance truth, and every inch of ground I refused to surrender. But it wasn't just my story anymore. The local media had picked up the threads. After the second TV segment, others followed regional newspapers, community podcasts, even a national HOA reform group that wanted to feature Stillwater Lake as a case study in homeowner resilience. One morning, Naomi sent me a link to an article titled "The Man Who Redirected the Lake: A Veteran's Fight Against HOA Overreach." The headline was dramatic, sure, but not inaccurate, and the story resonated. Emails poured in, messages from homeowners in other parts of the country, people who had been fined for the color of their flower pots or had their trees cut down without notice. They thanked me, not because I was a hero, but because I reminded them they weren't crazy, that what they were experiencing wasn't okay, that pushing back wasn't just possible, it was necessary. Naomi and I began receiving invitations to speak at local forums. We were asked to consult on HOA legislative reform at the state level. We even sat in on a panel at the community college titled "Civic Engagement in Private Neighborhoods." But it wasn't about fame. That wasn't why I did any of it. It was about something deeper, about healing and making sure no one else had to fight alone. Still, the HOA lawsuit loomed in the background. Even after Charlene's resignation, her fingerprints lingered on the paperwork like a stubborn stain. But Naomi was relentless. Discovery unearthed damning communications emails where Charlene had admitted to falsifying board votes, text messages mocking residents, who complained, memos instructing staff to bury Walker in paper until he gives up. That evidence, combined with Peter Langford's affidavit, shifted everything. The judge ruled in our favor, not just a dismissal of their suit, but a decisive, scathing judgment that the HOA had acted with gross overreach and demonstrated a pattern of targeted retaliation, and that Mr. Walker's actions were lawful, reasonable, and restorative, both ecologically and legally. They were ordered to pay restitution. I didn't take the full amount. Some of it went to rebuild the dock, of course, but the rest, I donated it. I created a small fund, the Stillwater Initiative, for residents in HOA neighborhoods facing legal harassment. Naomi helped set it up. Luis even offered to consult on community projects pro bono. The initiative started small, just a few $100s and a Gmail inbox. But word spread, because real justice doesn't end with winning. It starts when you use your win to build something better. One afternoon, Peter invited me to the first open HOA meeting since Charlene's departure. He asked if I would speak. I hesitated. I wasn't one for speeches. My service had taught me to listen more than talk, to observe the terrain before engaging. But this time I said yes. The clubhouse felt different now. The walls were still beige, the chairs still plastic, but the atmosphere had shifted, less like a tribunal, more like a town hall. People smiled, they asked questions, they weren't afraid. "I'm not here to talk about what happened to me," I began. "You all lived through that. You saw it. You heard me. Some challenged it. Some stayed silent. That's life. That's human. What matters is what we do now." I paused, letting the quiet settle. This neighborhood used to feel like a cage, but it doesn't have to. It can be something better. Community isn't built on uniform hedges and newsletter threats. It's built on trust, respect, and, when needed, accountability. I looked at the faces in front of me. A few teared up, most just listened. This dock out here, I continued, motioning toward the window, wasn't rebuilt with vengeance. It was rebuilt with help from people who believed we could be neighbors again, not enemies. I stepped back, nodding once. And that was it. I didn't need applause. I wasn't chasing catharsis. I had already found it. In the weeks that followed, something remarkable happened. The HOA restructured. They opened financial records to public view, offered mediation. Instead of automatic fines, changed the architecture review process to include homeowner votes, even removed the phrase compliance enforcement from their documents, replacing it with community support. Small changes, but meaningful. One morning, I walked out to the dock to find a boy fishing at the edge, maybe 10 years old, with a tackle box, too big for his knees, and a baseball cap 3 sizes too large. His mom stood nearby, watching nervously as I approached. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "He saw the dock, and..." I waved it off. "It's for everyone now." The boy looked up. "This your dock?" I nodded. He grinned. "It's awesome." I smiled. And just like that, The pain dissolved into something better. Not forgiveness necessarily, but freedom. That night, as the sun dipped behind the pines, and the lake reflected its final gold of the day, I sat on the end of the dock legs, dangling over the edge, bourbon in hand. I whispered to my wife like I used to. "See, we made it." The water lapped gently below, and this time no one tried to take it away. The seasons turned as they always do. Summer bled into fall, the lake cooled, and the trees along the shore donned their rust-red and golden cloaks like soldiers in dress uniform. Nature didn't care about bylaws or power struggles. It simply moved forward. So did I. The first crisp morning of October, I found myself doing something I hadn't done in years, whistling while brewing coffee. The kitchen still smelled faintly of cedar from the firewood I stacked near the stove. Outside the dock stood strong and proud, streaked with dew, a solitary bench, now bolted near the edge for quiet mornings and long thoughts. I had lived a full chapter of life in that house. A war of maps, silence, resilience, and water. And for the first time since I moved in the lake, reflected the calm I carried inside. But even peace has a sound. Sometimes it's the laughter of neighborhood children fishing off your dock. Sometimes it's the soft scrape of a rocking chair on wood as you sit beside a neighbor who once filed complaints, now bringing you homemade soup. Sometimes it's just wind through the pines, whispering that the war is over. The HOA was different now, not perfect, but human. Peter Langford had been elected president in a rare, unanimous vote. His first order of business, instituting a new clause in the bylaws. No resident may be denied access to historically deeded property without due process and independent arbitration. In other words, no more fence wars, no more unilateral decisions, no more Charlene Dunn, rule by decree. I stayed out of the spotlight after that. I didn't attend every board meeting or push to be some community figurehead. I'd done my part, I'd stood my ground, and now I wanted to sit live, heel. Occasionally a reporter would call wanting to revisit the HOA man who dried the lake, but I rarely agreed to interviews anymore. The story had been told. What mattered now was the life that came after. One afternoon, Clara stopped by the retired nurse, the banana bread woman. She brought a homemade pie this time, pecan, with a flaky crust that crumbled like snow. "You know," she said, sitting on my porch, "I've lived here 27 years. I've never seen neighbors this friendly." I nodded, watching two teenagers paddle by in a kayak, the water gently rippling in their wake. It wasn't friendliness they were missing. I said it was permission. Permission to be decent again, to stop being afraid. You'd be amazed how much damage fear can do when it hides behind structure. She nodded, her hands folded on her lap. "You gave us that permission." I didn't reply, just sipped my coffee and let the silence say it all. That winter, for the first time, the HOA didn't fine anyone for holiday decorations. In fact, they encouraged them. There were twinkling light snowmen, even a 12-foot inflatable reindeer that would have made Charlene pop a vein. And in the center of it all, the community dock rebuilt by volunteers, decorated with pine garlands and a wooden sign that read, "The lake is for everyone." I never asked who made it. I didn't need to. Spring came early the next year. The snow melted in sheets, racing toward the lake with giddy urgency. Luis returned for a weekend visit, and we walked the length of the drainage ditch, now a thriving waterway lined with thick reeds and darting fish. We didn't speak much. Old soldiers don't have to. As we stood on the dock, he said, "You ever think you'd end up here fighting HOA battles in suburbia?" I chuckled. After Mogadishu, I figured I'd seen everything. He laughed, then looked out at the water. "You know what you did right. You didn't just protect your land, you made people care again." I shrugged. I just wanted to fish off my damn dock. He grinned, and look what it became. Later that week, Peter invited me to a small backyard gathering. No speeches, just grilled burgers, iced tea, and a handful of residents sitting in folding chairs talking like humans instead of walking HOA rulebooks. A woman I didn't recognize approached me holding a casserole dish. "My parents live 2 blocks over," she said. "They told me what you did, thank you. Just did what was right." That's rare these days. Maybe it was. Or maybe it just felt rare because we'd forgotten what standing firm looked like. That night, I stood once more on my dock, the stars blooming across the sky like a quiet riot. I thought about the journey, the letters, the lawyers, the lies, the laughter, the losses. I thought of my wife, of the promise I made to her when I bought this house that it would be our peace. It finally was. I whispered her name to the wind and felt something stir in my chest, something soft, something whole. For the first time in years, I felt fully home. I took one last sip of bourbon, exhaled slowly, and turned back toward the house. No more battles, no more fences, just peace water, and the sound of a neighborhood learning how to be one again.